Hello. Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon, evening. Many of you know me. It's so great to see you all. My name is Jessica Kaminsky, and I'm here with the Center for Shared Prosperity. The center's mission, we're about 2 years old, and our mission is to dedicate the talents, energies, and innovation of the university and community to dismantle economic, cultural, social, and structural barriers of entry to move towards greater justice and equity through our principles of compassion, collaboration, and curiosity so that our Greater Pittsburgh region can achieve shared prosperity. So as part of my work at the center, my colleague Jordan Morozak and I launched what we called Reading in Action about a year and a half ago. Our plan was to do just that. We were going to read the book In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, which was written by one of our panelists, Devarian Baldwin. And we're going to use that to help us reflect on Carnegie Mellon's relationship to our region. And then we were going to take an action to move us closer to shared prosperity. The time we weren't sure what exactly that action would be. So this was a leap of faith by everybody involved. But pretty quickly, the University Archives team joined on into Reading in Action, and they did an amazing job of bringing together resources from the archives, documents from the archives that really helped take the themes of the book In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower and personalize them to us here at Carnegie Mellon. We were also joined by about 25 faculty, staff, and students from across the university for 5 weeks of reading, discussion, and reflection. Through this process, we found some questions that we really wanted to continue exploring together. Mostly questions about the financial relationship between Carnegie Mellon and our region. And then more specifically about the tax-exempt status of our universities and how that related to our mission to be a good neighbor to the people of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. So for over a year and a half, our group has met every other week over their lunch to research, to listen. We met with subject matter experts. We shared local news. We planned, we discussed, we made a whole lot of Google documents. And today's a testament to the power of people coming together to pursue a shared and important question. The panel tonight is the action that we are taking. It is one of many actions that we're taking to move us towards being a good neighbor in our region. But the Reading in Action work has also challenged each of us individually to be good neighbors. If you are here and you were part of the original Reading in Action group, if you were one of the University Archives teams, if you were a person who joined one of our meetings as an expert to share your knowledge with us, or if you've otherwise been part of this effort, or if you're part of GSA, our co-host for tonight, would you please raise your hand? Thank you. Thank you all for the work that you have done. One of my favorite people and writers, Adrienne Marie Brown, uses fractals as a metaphor to talk about work like this. She says, what we practice at the small scale sets the patterns for the whole system. It has been my honor to practice being a fractal amongst every one of you, so thank you very much. I have just a couple quick housekeeping notes before I turn over the mic. The restrooms, as you probably noticed, are located right outside of the door where you came in. This event is being recorded, and we do have plans to share it on the Center for Shared Prosperity's website, so all of your friends who missed this awesome party today, make sure they get to see it. We'll have a reception catered by another fantastic community partner, first connected to us through our partners at Beam, but the caterer is Sugar and Butter, and if you didn't see it on the way in, it looks delicious. And we will also be tonight having a question and answer portion of our panel. So you might have already seen this up here, but we're going to be using the platform Slido for our question and answer session tonight. Slido allows you to both submit a question and you can upvote a question that has already been submitted. So to do this, please go to slido.com and enter in the code that you see here, 3693410. And then you can either type in your question, it'll look something like this. You can either type in your question up at the top or hit the green button that says ask there to add a question. You can also click on the thumbs up icon and that'll upvote a question for us. We have our team in the back who will be helping with that back there. Thank you all very much for helping with Slido tonight. And you can also see in there that there are already questions that are populated in Slido. These are the questions that were submitted by folks as you registered for the event. If somebody submitted a question, we already put them in there. So there are questions already in there that you can upvote. And I did warn our panelists tonight that if people are on their phone, it is because they're participating in Slido. For sure, that's what they're doing on their phone, so it's fine if they're looking down at it. We'll also put up the instructions for Slido as we get to the question and answer portion, but we definitely encourage you to participate in Slido throughout the entire panel event. So thank you all so much for being here this evening, and let me now turn it over to our co-hosts for the evening, the Graduate Student Assembly.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here and represent the Graduate Student Assembly, GSA. I'm Gaurav Balakrishnan, our current Vice President for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and also in the audience is Katie Jordan, who is our Vice President for External Affairs. So I just will give you like a 2-sentence, probably just read what that says, but an introduction to GSA. So we're a branch of student government that represents all graduate students at Carnegie Mellon. And our mission is to advocate and support the diverse needs of all CMU graduate students in their personal, professional, and public lives. And what this looks like is we have 7 executive committee members who are vice presidents with different portfolios. I just mentioned what 2 of ours are. We have others related to academic affairs, campus affairs, et cetera. Then we also have general body meetings where we bring together representative student body to come and vote on important decisions that we need to make, and also recommendations that we want to offer to our administrative partners, many of who are in the room. So very happy to see you all here. Yeah, I'm very excited for GSA to be one of the co-hosts of this event. I think it's a very important topic. And without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our fantastic panelists. So we'll start off with someone Jess already mentioned, Dr. Devarian Baldwin, author of In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, and the Paul E. Rather Distinguished Professor of American Studies at Trinity College. Let's all give Dr. Baldwin a hand. Next, we have Lisa Frank, the Chief Operating and Administrative Officer for the City of Pittsburgh. Dan Davis, Economic Justice Organizer for Pittsburgh United. And Dr. Ila Nurbaksh, the K&L Gates Professor of Ethics and Computational Technologies and the Executive Director of the Center for Shared Prosperity. The moderator for tonight will be Emma Foltz, a journalist for Public Source focused on higher education. So thank you to all our panelists and the moderator for the putting up the fantastic event tonight. I'll hand it off to Emma.
Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here tonight. We have a fantastic group of panelists here with us to help us explore this very complex and nuanced topic, and I want to devote as much time as possible to hearing their insights. So to start, I have a question for all of the panelists. How does taxation play a role in a nonprofit serving as a good neighbor? And why don't we start with Devarian for that question?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. Hope you can hear me okay. Yes, you can hear me just fine. Fantastic. Wonderful to be here. So to get right to it, how does the kind of the tax exempt status shape higher ed as a good neighbor? So just a little bit of backdrop. Right before our eyes, colleges and universities have become the biggest employers, healthcare providers, policing agents, and landholders in America today. And the landholder thing is important because this land is tax exempt, property tax exempt. And so what happens on this land? This is land where you have construction companies and private investors in biotech and computer science and software development investing and using that land as a tax shelter that has a directly adverse effect on surrounding neighborhoods. Because what do those property taxes go to? They go to things like public schools, public works, structural facilities for the city. So there's a direct relationship here between the prosperity seeded on campuses and its extraction from the host community. And that's facilitated explicitly through the tax exemption that's given to universities under the presumption that they're providing a public good. But in the current moment of our service and knowledge economy, that tax exemption has served as a financial shelter and a mechanism by which to transfer public dollars into the private interests of both public and private universities.
Thank you, Devarian. Lisa, why don't you go next?
Thank you. I think I'll just try to build off that rather than repeat some of those things. This is what I spent my time on today. I worked a little to finish up funding for the Charles Anderson Bridge. You might notice that was closed a little peremptorily. That's a $50 million enterprise. I worked a little bit on the paving schedule. I worked a little bit on hiring somebody in the HR department whose job it's going to be to look through all of our job descriptions and try to strip out some of the goofy stuff that prevents our citizens from being employed. You really need a driver's license to be a crossing guard. What do we really mean when we try to block people who are returning citizens? So all of that stuff takes money, and that's important, and it's important, in this context. Taxation is also predicated on a relationship of mutual obligation. It already presupposes mutual obligation. And if it was medieval times, you would pay your taxes and your lord would offer you protection, and he would set the price, and you didn't really get to vote about the rate of that or the nature of the services that you were provided. But in a democracy, taxation is really how everyone, or at least adults with assets and an income, contribute to and participate in assuming shared responsibility for community care. That's how we get a pool of resources large enough to do things that very few of us could do by ourselves, have a Charles Anderson Bridge, or get the snow off the roads or put out fires. And budgeting is how we struggle together to set priorities for our funding, and procurement and auditing are how we ensure transparency and fairness so that the public knows what we're doing, why we're doing, who we're doing it with. So in charities, and I'd like to point out that charities under PI law are a sort of different animal than a nonprofit under federal law. We might want to talk about that a little bit. But when they bypass taxation, they're skipping out on contributing resources. That's why we get to ask questions about what they provide in the HUP test. But they also bypass robust public accountability. And that's why, from my point of view, for charities to earn their exemptions, they have to not only contribute something of value, but also have to create structures of accountability that give the community some voice in priority setting.
Right on the line. Two excellent acts to follow. I think about the role tax imposition play from nonprofits in terms of three categories. So first category I want to talk about is what I call ecosystem. Nonprofits know and need to know that their success is tied to the success of the city that hosts them. It's impossible for a nonprofit to be successful in a place that is failing, for instance, in infrastructure. So that ecosystem play is one very powerful reason to imagine paying, because you know that your futures are intertwined forever. The second reason is different. I call it morality. Does the charitable purpose of the nonprofit, the way that they have an ethos about how they're influencing society and making it better, does it afford direct positive impact on society? Or is payment through taxation going to help the very charitable purpose they have move forward? So that to me is another litmus test for taxation for a nonprofit. The third one I call consequentiality. It's kind of like consequentialism. And this goes right back to what Devarian said. In the very act of being innovative, for instance, spawning outstanding startup companies, a nonprofit can result in harm to the communities around it through gentrification, through increased housing prices, or through innovations that literally improve the quality of life of one group of people and don't do that for other groups of people, and therefore increase disparities in quality of life. And so on that front, from a consequentialist point of view, I think another reason to think about payment is the payment able in some way to be reparative to the negative consequences that a nonprofit has had, even if it was unintentional, in creating disparities in society? So those are my three answers.
You can actually pass that down and I'll use this.
Okay.
Does it work now? There we go. Hey everyone. So yeah, the original question, how does taxation play a role in how nonprofits act as a good neighbor? You know, I think when I'm trying to evaluate that question, I'm thinking, what is a good neighbor? I think everyone here gave a really great technical response, which is important. But when I think about my good neighbors, I think about my neighbor that lives to the right of me. And when I'm out of town, she'll come over and check on my cat because she cares about me as a human being, right? And when we talk about taxation, there, you know, I was talking with Lisa earlier, there's this mentality that a lot of people have, taxation is theft, yada, yada. But the reality is taxation is good. Taxes are a way in which, as Lisa said, we're pooling our resources together. You know, it's a way that we show that we care for the people in our community, you know, by allowing us to do more together than we would be able to do alone. And so, and on top of that, they're democratic. So it's also a way in which the community can allocate those resources together. And so when I think about how does taxation play a role in nonprofits being a good neighbor, I mean, if we're talking about nonprofits, you know, accepting these tax exemptions gladly, that's them telling us that they don't think that we should have control over where that money goes. And how can you be a good neighbor if you're not willing to pitch in to the pool of money that is supposed to be helping our community, you know, and gladly accepting, you know, these exemptions, despite having the financial ability to cover them. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for all of those thoughtful responses. And I'd love to hear from Dan and Ela on the next question. What opportunities or tensions can a large university presence create in cities like Pittsburgh? And perhaps what opportunities and tensions have you seen CMU's presence create in the city? And Ela, if you'd like to start, or Dan.
Okay, I'll start. So opportunities and tensions means I'm going to try and paint good news and bad news. So here goes trying to do both. On the opportunity side, something that excites me and inspires me is when policy innovation at the university, when the university's presence as an innovator can actually improve the outcome socially. And really simple little example, but important example. Nick Muller is a professor here. His policy innovation is he's figured out how to take the stock prices of these giant corporations like Chevron and Exxon, and he's figured out how to discount them based on the amount of harm they do to society. And it's pretty amazing to see because you can see a whole ton of companies that actually have a negative stock price. And this is peer-reviewed, published in the best articles, you know, in the best journals. That's when the policy innovation of the university puts sunlight on inequity in society, or even when it's so like heavily peer-reviewed that it allows boards of trustees to think differently about, for example, their investment practices. So to me, that's an example of an opportunity where a university that's all about being innovative can actually use innovation in some way that actually can bend an arc toward equity instead of inequity. But tension, and maybe this is opportunity, but it's mostly tension in a way, is power structures. Universities by their very nature are privileged institutions. They have power. And as a result, as they operate in a society, they can, without even intending to, but not explicitly designing to not do this, they can take away power and agency from subaltern communities, from people who live in the community, right? From those who are their neighbors. And because they have privilege, because their voice is listened to in the White House, in the halls of Harrisburg, right? That opportunity snowballs, snowballs, and they get greater and greater privilege over time. So the tension is you can do good, but you also have extreme levels of privilege within the ivory tower. And the question becomes, can you learn to cede away that privilege? Can you learn to give agency to others? Dan mentioned the idea of letting other people make decisions about how to spend the money, right? Can you be modest enough to enable others to have the power to decide? Or will you always feel like, I'm going to be generous, but I get to decide what to do? And that's a major tension, people are always afraid in society to give up, to cede agency or power. And so you end up with ossified power relationships. The last one where I think it's a tension in both directions is standard of life. Universities like ours and Pitt and so many others have major enactment in the areas like air quality, lead testing. We were very active in Ohio when the train derailed. At the right isolated moments and for certain target marginalized populations, we can be a force for increasing quality of life by stopping harm. But the question is, on net, are we able to point our arrows in a way where we engage with people as peers and improve quality of life for all? Or is it this cheese model? What's the cheese with holes in the middle called? Swiss cheese, where some communities are actually helped and improved in quality of life by us simultaneously as other communities are hurt and hindered. And not doing that goes back to innovation, but also a willingness to be modest enough to allow others into the conversation of how you design and make decisions. So it is a tension because the university is powerful. And as soon as you have power, good and bad can both happen quite simultaneously.
Yeah. When I think about opportunities and tensions for Pittsburgh, something that is often going through my mind, and honestly, Eli, you mentioned a lot of really wonderful ways in which CMU can benefit and does benefit the community. But I think a lot of the times when we think about nonprofits, and charities and whatnot, we often think about them and the good that they're doing, but that doesn't necessarily outweigh the costs that also come with it. And I think you did a really good job of kind of tying those together. Usually, so I went to college in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, called Grinnell, and it was a very wealthy college in a very small town. And they would beautify the area with new art projects and stuff like that. And it was always under the guise of, we're doing this for the community. But the community was never actually consulted. And in a lot of ways, our institutions like CMU do similar things. We have this beautiful building. This is my first time in Tepper ever. Is Tepper, right? This is Tepper. But, absolutely gorgeous building, that could benefit our society or our community in really wonderful ways. But it's not really open to all of us. It's not really doing the benefits to the society that sometimes these institutions will have you believe. And I think what it comes down to, you kind of mentioned it in your introductory statement, it's about like gentrification. I think a lot of us have this idea of like, we make things better. And I think there's a reactionary view where it's like, if you make things better, it's gentrification, it's bad, get rid of it. But that's not the case. People want nice things. We all want nice things. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's also are we making these nice things and implementing them in a way where the community actually benefits, which is what you were kind of hitting on a little bit. If we're just, producing nice things so that it's a facade and everyone looks at it in a beautiful way, that's not actually creating shared prosperity. That's not actually making sure that everyone in the community has access. And the reality is not everyone has access to all of the benefits at CMU. CMU is a top tier institution. There's no negating that. And it can come with so many opportunities, but by not paying their taxes, that's not helping our public school system. That's not helping people in the community actually get the resources necessary to be part of the benefits in all ways. And I think that there's ways in which, CMU tries to go around that, but at the end of the day, it's always money that they are choosing for themselves how to spend. And so it always reflects positively for them. It's still accomplishing their own independent mission and maybe not the mission of the community.
Thank you. And my next question is for Lisa. As of 2021, about 93% of Carnegie Mellon's property was tax exempt, which left about $10 million on the table in city, municipal, and school district taxes. What are the city's biggest financial needs, and how does the tax exempt status of major nonprofits like CMU impact that reality?
If I may, I'm just going to roll back a little bit on the last question. consulting the community, oftentimes you'll see universities and other agencies go to tremendous lengths to have great community engagement efforts and teams of people who do, in an effort really to find out from folks, what's going on and what would you like to do. And I think that's really important. I do also want to point out the much more kind of ancient technology of taxation. We elect representatives, we elect a mayor, we get together, we put the money in the pot, we decide how to spend it. And that really is the most universal form of community consultation. I'll say that. How does what are the city's biggest needs? I will say the city relies on property tax. This also rolls up to Allegheny County taxes, library taxes, payroll preparation taxes, school taxes. People have mentioned that. And about a third of all city property, some of it is quite valuable property, is off the tax rolls for all of these bodies. Here's what I'm thinking about today. We run the city pretty lean, like really lean. And a lot of that has to do with the ways in which the city has changed. When we were steel manufacturing city, I think there were 600,000 people in Pittsburgh. There's something more like 300,000. There's no question that loss of residents is having an impact on the tax base. But it is super important that as we replace those taxable industries with other industries, that we're really thinking about that, because we do real harm to the folks in the city who are trying to take care of the city. So the impact that's on my mind right now, and I could list them all day long, are the folks who pick up the trash. Folks who pick up the trash. We need about 150 people to get through the city and pick up the trash on any given day, to do it in the way that we do it now, which is relatively unsafe. We put 2 people on a truck. We should have 3 people on a truck. And as a result of that, injury and workers' compensation costs in the Department of Public Works are much higher than they should be. And we're harming people who we also don't pay enough to live in the city as the rents rise. So at the end of the day, I think the impact of not really having the resource nor planning in a particularly thoughtful way, or having a particularly robust conversation about how everyone in the community, not just our residents, not just our for-profit entities, is thinking about how we actually resource a thriving, welcoming, and safe city is dangerous.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'd love to hear from Devarian on this next question as well. One way that municipalities across the country have received greater contributions from their major nonprofits are through agreements for payments in lieu of taxes, known as pilots. CMU does not currently have a pilot agreement with the city of Pittsburgh. Devarian, how have you seen these agreements impact municipalities and universities across the country?
Thanks for the question. Pilots, as you've just outlined, their impact, first of all, I want to say that taxation is really important, but it's not a panacea. It doesn't solve all problems. In all the work that I've done in terms of reorganizing and restructuring responsibilities for universities, people drive to the taxation question because I'm a tax-paying citizen of the city or what have you. And so it's dangerous when we think of taxation as the condition upon which we can be citizens. So I just want to put that out there first. That's not the only way we can be citizens. But number 2, this is borne out in the fact that we have universities that do pay pilots. So for example, Yale University pays a $14 million a year pilot, at least. Now I think it's going up a little bit because we fought for it. I was part of the campaign to fight for increased pilots in New Haven with the Yale Pay Your Fair Share campaign under New Haven Rising organizing group. But we have to be clear that they pay $14 million, the most that any university pays in the country. And yet that's $157 million short if we actually assessed their property values of the property owned in the city of New Haven. They're the biggest landholder in the city. So what does this mean? This means that schools have 7-year-old textbooks. Children have classes in bathrooms. Public works like fire and police, however you feel about the police and other services, don't get funded. That's a direct impact, even with the biggest pilot in the country. University of Pennsylvania, in your neck of the woods, they refuse to pay a pilot. They're the only Ivy League school that will not pay a pilot. But under the Penn for Pilots campaign, they pushed UPenn to an agreement to offer $10 million a year for 10 years for one particular service, which is asbestos removal in the public school buildings. So that's $100 million over 10 years, which is based on an annual $20 billion endowment. Now, I give you the endowment numbers just to give you a sense of how much money is seeded on these campuses, but that doesn't even include the value that comes from their property holdings. So these are things that are happening currently, but there are other ways to do this. So, you know, the problem with pilots is that there are some cities like Richmond, the city of Richmond, Virginia, their municipality is pushing for a pilot, but that's being driven because they want to underfund or defund public higher education. So the argument there is that if you pay a pilot, then if the public school, if the public university pay a pilot, it's a way of undermining their power. And so I actually advocate for a different approach. That pilot may be it should be the conversation starter. So, for example, in the city, in the city of Boston and Massachusetts more broadly, they argue for any nonprofit that owns at least $15 million worth of property would pay 25% of the value of their property taxes if they're properly assessed. Why? Because 25% is about what the city pulls from property taxes to pay for public services. But this approach, where you begin to say, okay, have a pilot, have a conversation, and then I advocate for something like a prorated approach. So if a university is actually engaging in a robust public engagement, then they will pay less of a pilot. If they choose to not offer public engagement, then they pay more of a pilot. Because the argument of the pilot, the problem with the pilot is that it can say that, well, I paid my pilot, I've done enough, leave me alone. It becomes a one-time contractual arrangement. And we want pilots to become conversation starters and not just simply purely contractual. That's my assessment.
Sure. Thank you, Javarian. And given that CMU is largely tax exempt, Ela, what are some of the concrete ways that the university has supported the Pittsburgh community financially or otherwise?
This gets right at what Javarian was saying at the very end. There's, basic number things. We have something like 19,000 jobs that CMU supports, so pays labor. And that, of course, has downstream consequences. You have startups, right? Some 450 startups that CMU has created. But we talked about this. The startups have positive and negative consequences through gentrification on the community. So it's complicated. The one that I think is really important to point out, though, is the charitable mission. And it gets at what Javarian was saying. What's the fundamental charitable mission? What's the value the university holds? And what are we doing on the charitable mission that directly impacts the people of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County in a positive way? And I'll give you some examples in direct education and in community-based research. On direct education, of course, there's the fundamental question of, can you take a privileged institution like CMU and open its doors to local students? Because fundamentally, we're about education, right? Number one mission of the university. And insofar as we can have more local students benefit from that education, local students from marginalized backgrounds who would never be able to afford to come here and pay full freight, then you're achieving a good in society, because you're achieving for them a career distinction and a possibility for intergenerational wealth in the future if they can achieve home equity, which is critically what upper class does and what lower class can't do in the society we live in. So we work with City Charter School. We have programs with them through LEAP. We have a STEM ambassador program that helps local kids out. We have Slice that's doing training on students on how to have students engage with local youth outside of the university. There's lots and lots, probably a dozen programs like that. The biggest, most exciting one recently is this huge thing that got announced here just last month, maybe, called the Rails Fellowship, which is interesting because what they're doing is they're taking an endowment, a massive endowment. I think it's $150 million. And it's going to fund 95 master's and graduate students a year to come from marginalized backgrounds. They get pulled into Carnegie Mellon, they get paid full freight, including spending money, including housing, including tuition. They get career counseling, and they get placed in jobs at the end of their degree. That's interesting. But for that to be truly effective to our hosts, we need a significant proportion of those 95 students to come from Allegheny County and not just internationally. And that's a critical thing that we have to do in programming that. On the community-based research side, I kind of talked about this already, but the good we can do is through community-based research that works with community members to shine either sunlight on inequities and make the inequity undeniable. So you can't resist, but to do something about it. I've had many a battle with Allegheny County Health Department on that front around issues that we want them to move on. And direct engagement where the research at the university is about the research of empowering. So Night Owls Bakers was run by a dear friend of mine, two dear friends of mine, Mary Lou Arscott and Kristen Hughes, training local children in, I believe, the Garfield area on how to become bakers, run an organization, and make money selling bread to their neighbors. Those are little examples. Metro 21 tries to do this by changing the way traffic lights work so that pedestrians are safer and so we burn less fossil fuels. So there's lots of little projects like that, and the projects can have good potential impact, but that's the collaborative research side that can be of value. What I really care about fundamentally is that our charitable mission is executed every day in the community that we're in. And that goes right back down to how we're actually lifting the potential quality of life of children in our region, because we're educational. So that education has to reach into every child that's in our area.
Can I just jump in real quick? I'm sorry. Can I just jump in real quick? I just want to add a short caveat. I think I call this the myth of the schoolhouse. We continue to talk about higher education as primarily being a place that teaches classes and conducts pure research, that we are an educational body. But the hard scrabble reality is that we are the biggest employers, real estate holders, healthcare providers, and policers in our cities and towns. And with that, then our public charter, whether you're public or private university, are the conditions upon which we evaluate our contributions must extend beyond just simply our educational output. You can't have that kind of impact in the world and then simply evaluate our public good based on our educational outcomes. If you're going to be the biggest employer or the landholder, then your public good evaluation must also extend to that role you play in society. I just wanted to add that to the conversation as well.
Thank you very much, Devarian. And to that very point, Lisa and Dan, how do you assess CMU's contributions to the city so far? And Lisa, we can start with you.
Sure, and I think I'll pick up from where Professor Baldwin left off. I mean, and I also I'm really interested in this reevaluation of stock prices, because I think universities do have to be evaluated as largest landowners, and that's a lot bit why we talk about taxes, but they are biggest employers and they are drivers of industries. And we usually also only kind of look at one column. We look at the benefits column, and we don't actually do that other part of the analysis. So I did the homework and read Professor Baldwin's book, who asks us to think about what does it mean that for-profit businesses have to compete with tax-exempt businesses. When we see the charitable sector grow and grow and grow, and that's not unrelated to those tax exemptions. It's not unrelated to the way money flows and construction and surplus and where all of that grows, right? So as that is happening, what are the for-profit businesses that are being crowded out? Did anybody ever study that? If it is the largest employer, what are we doing about wages and unions? Has anybody ever assessed that? People now talk about our charitable sector talking about monopoly and monopsony. That means artificially reduced wages for people. What does that mean? So, we're always, when we talk about community benefits that universities or hospitals or large not-for-profits, mega charities, sometimes called, give out, we always look in the benefit column, but nobody ever tots up the opportunity costs, the lost wages, the costs of push out. We don't quantify that. And I think we should do that research. I think we should understand that. And I think to Professor Baldwin's point, be evaluating tools that go to each of those largest landowner. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about money. Largest employer. What are we doing there? Largest spawner of startups. What does that mean? And who's not? Because they don't either have the growing privilege of being the growing largest, or because they don't have the tax exemption, able to start a business here. And what would that tell us about what the university needs to do if we look at the institutional impact rather than the schoolhouse mission? I think that's really important.
I just want to make sure that I have the question correct. You were asking, how do we assess the contributions that CMU is doing? Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything that Lisa was just actually talking about. And, I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to, and actually pulling back on something that you were talking about, or a response to something I mentioned, Lisa, you said that CMU consults on projects. Most of our, nonprofits are consulting on projects. And that is true to some extent, but they're consulting typically on predetermined projects. So it's like, I know obviously we're here to talk about CMU, but UPMC, when they were doing their Mercy expansion and when they're doing their Oakland work, they're like, okay, we're going to build a new hospital. Like, let's start talking to the community. It didn't start with, oh, we have $2 billion. How does the community want us to spend it? It's, we're building this. You can have some decisions on like how that impacts you and like the externalities of it all. And I think in a lot of ways, there are tons of projects in which the community is consulted when it comes to how CMU also operates, but they are predetermined projects. I can't speak for certainty all the time, but I'm going to say probably most of the time. And so then that kind of brings in the question of how much does that actually matter for community consultation? If the community isn't actually able to democratically allocate where that money goes in the same way that we are with our taxes, because we can go to meetings and we can try to actually shift massive funds of money, whether or not that actually happens in reality is a whole nother story. But there's a legal obligation of our government to hold that open for the public. CMU is a private institution. They have no legal obligations to consult with the community in the same way that our government does. And I know, Devarian, that you mentioned that, taxation isn't the end all be all and shouldn't be all that we're fighting for. But I do think it is an important thing to keep in mind as we talk about assessing these contributions, because although it may benefit the community in ways, and I think that's very important, it's not the same as the community actually being able to sit there and say, oh yeah, you had X amount of dollars. I would have also wanted to spend it on this project. Instead, they're just building projects that are pushing forward the mission of CMU, Great.
Thank you very much, Dan. And I have just one last question for Ela before we turn it over to the questions from the audience. How can CMU best support and foster inclusive prosperity in Pittsburgh?
Just one small question.
Sure.
We've talked about direct payment. I want to talk about everything else that a university can do, because spending money is something we do. In particular, we buy an incredible amount of food, for example, every year. So one of the big projects that Jessica and Jordan are leading right now in the center is what we call equitable procurement, which is figuring out a way to have every local vendor who comes from a marginalized background be an approved vendor at CMU, help them and fund them if need be to be able to accept our credit cards, help them to be able to upcharge the right amount so they can pay the credit card fees and not get poor because now they're taking a different kind of payment, and then create the right website so that all the admins at CMU who are ordering dozens upon dozens of lunches a day for their staff can order those lunches not from Panera, not from a national chain, but from local minority-owned businesses. That's one example with a lot of money moving right now. But you need the money to move in the right ways. And that's why we're collaborating with the Beam Collaborative to try and figure out the way to do that whole procurement thing. Another thing for me is breaking the wall. And I hear, Devarian, we are more than an educational institution. But after 26 years, what I've seen is transformative in the lives of individual people who go through education, and it lifts them into a position of power in society. So even though we need to be judged as a real estate holder, even though we need to be judged as a spawner of entrepreneurial activities, I think we also have to have a moral obligation to educate those in Pittsburgh so that those in Pittsburgh can have a brighter future. And that's just, we have to be a schoolhouse, and it has to be an and. Third one is direct engagement, which goes back to what Dan said. The Center for Shared Prosperity exists precisely because we created a permanent endowment at CMU, where the spending of that endowment is not decided upon by any human being at Carnegie Mellon. We have a community cabinet, the C3, that several of you are on. The community cabinet decides how to spend the money. The community cabinet designs the pilot projects we do, and the money flows out of CMU. And we've created low friction ways to get a ton of money out of CMU for that. The whole reason for that to exist is to demonstrate the power and efficacy that you can have when you actually trust the wisdom and lived experience of the community members in deciding how to spend money to create systemic change. So that's why we're doing that experiment, and that's a permanent experiment. Last one is the thing I talked about a little bit before. Universities have that privilege thing I talked about. I do this all the time. I go to Davos, I go to other places in Switzerland, I go to the United Nations to do what? To present visualizations to make undeniable climate change, to make undeniable the way in which pollution, particularly air pollution, is exacerbating inequity in society, to make undeniable the ways in which runaway capitalism is actually destroying the world. And the stories that I tell there work because I'm at a fancy schmancy university with amazing engineers who can create visualizations that people just can't deny. They look at them and they fall away from denying it and having doubt. There's a book by Naomi Oreskes called Merchants of Doubt that everybody has to read. Instead of being doubtful, it moves people to a position of saying, okay, we have to solve this problem. And so if I go back to what you were saying, Lisa, we need to visualize harm. If we can visualize the harm that any nonprofit does and show it in a way that gets people beyond bickering about whether the harm exists or not, we can move to a different place in the space where instead of bickering about whether there is or isn't harm and how much harm, you can talk about how to cure the problem instead of arguing about whether the problem exists. And that fundamental to me is something universities are good at that, actually. We can do visualizations. We know how to do that. And so that I think is a useful role we can play.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone in the audience who submitted questions for us tonight. We're going to move to answering those now. And I think the first question that I want to ask is a great fit for Devarian. This type of activism is challenging and filled with defeats. What are positive case studies or examples of universities being a good neighbor to their city?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I don't necessarily have a number of examples where the university has been a good neighbor to the city, but I have examples of where the community pushed the university to act better. So, for example, in the height of the pandemic, I was asked to participate with an organization called New Haven Rising, again, as I mentioned earlier, in New Haven, Connecticut, to push Yale University to increase their pilot. And just last year, we were able to have a small victory of increasing it by $10 million over the next 6 years. And we're very proud of that. And I'm very proud to be a part of that. But again, that came from multiple years of direct action, of car parades during the pandemic that stopped traffic in downtown New Haven. There's that. One example that I do have from a university-driven component is not in the US directly, but it's always Canada, right? It's always Canada. But they have their own problems too, but especially on racial lines, especially for Indigenous people. But one positive outcome is that the University of Winnipeg, which is in the province that has the largest Indigenous population in the world, where the University of Winnipeg took on a sustainability approach to building out their university. And what that meant for them was that, well, who surrounds their campus? It was primarily what they call new Canadians, which we call immigrants, and Indigenous community members. And they were becoming the largest students on that campus. And because the student body was shifting, and this is happening in the US as well, but we're in more denial about it. The demographic of the traditional student is changing across North America, quicker in Canada. And because of that, those students have different requirements. They are largely adults, they have children, and they're working poor, working class. So they started building out housing that was mixed income at all levels for both students and residents, from premium rates down to rent geared to income. And the middle tiered housing is interchangeable. You can't tell what kind of unit you're moving into. And the only difference in the housing for the premium rates is the balconies, but everything else is the same. They have, and this is supported by the university. This is built by the university for both students and residents. They have free Wi-Fi in the common areas for those who can't afford Wi-Fi in the individual units. Their common areas across the campus are governed by a community charter. This is really important. For all the beautiful towers of glass and steel that CMU is building, that's largely underwritten by tax exemption. What would it mean if the common areas were governed by a community charter, which means that their use are dictated by community organizations under a charter for public use. Wouldn't that be something? And then finally, they kicked out Aramark, Tedesco, Marriott, whatever horrible food service company y'all all hold, and they built their own food service company where 70% of the workers are from what they call difficult to employ residents in the area. First Nations, single mothers, recently incarcerated, LGBTQ+, and they're moving from wages to profit sharing. And then on the procurement side, 65% of the raw materials come from small farms within a 100-kilometer radius. Every workstation has a compost bin, and they take their cooking oil and send it out to be converted into biodiesel. This is within North America. This is happening right now. This is not a pie in the sky, unicorn, communist, socialist propaganda. This is the conditions of the things that universities actually already do and retrofitting them with a different purpose, with a robust vision of sustainability. Finally, I want to say we must begin talking about campus police abolition. We have to talk about that, because why do we have campus police that enact a two-tier policing system where you can have a predominantly white student and a predominantly non-white resident committing the same infraction, but the student goes through the dean of students and the resident goes through the criminal justice system, where the primary function of university police is to protect the interests of the university, even though they increasingly have jurisdiction in non-university areas. And I know that's an issue as well, increasingly in Pittsburgh. But the one thing that universities can do, which we know actually is a reduction of crime and reduction of harm, is housing safety, is food safety. We throw away tons of food every day in universities, cafeterias. What would it mean if we converted that food into meals for communities of need every day, right? That's public safety. Housing, as we build out these luxury residences, dictate, demand that a piece of that housing be for low-income residents to mix in with these communities. Demand that the county or city assessor in your town begin to assess what actually happens on these campuses. Because while campus buildings are tax exempt, if they're engaging in for-profit activity, all we have to do is make the county or city assessor assess the use of those properties and begin to tax them. But because a lot of times the assessor went to CMU, they won't turn their eyes to assessing the properties adequately. So these are things that have been done, can be done, and should be done when it comes to a more robust and equitable relationship between universities and their communities.
And a follow-up question for you, Devarian. This was asked by a couple of people in the audience. Would you mind explaining why universities are tax exempt?
Yeah, that's real. So I'll be real quick. So
Sure.
in the tax code, they're designated like other nonprofits as 501c3 entities, which gives them a tax exempt status under the IRS taxation code. The particular reason why universities fall under this is because the idea is that, well, you receive a tax exemption because you provide benefits to the public that would otherwise not be offered, i.e. higher education. So in exchange for providing higher education, we provide to you a tax exemption to compensate for the service you provide. But as we look at higher education in America, it's more exclusive, more elite. How many Pittsburgh residents go to CMU? Something we talked about earlier. So there's a way in which that tax exemption in the current economy, in an economy without factories, has been manipulated to benefit the interest of the university, but actually not meet the needs of the public good, the condition and the foundation upon which that arrangement was established in the first place.
Thank you very much. And I think this next question is perfect for Dan. Does being a good neighbor include paying workers livable above market wages and benefits?
Yeah, I'm going to get in. Well, I mean, sorry. The answer is yes. The lead in with the is actually going to be building off of what Devarian was actually just saying. So we keep having this conversation about hitting my water bottle. We keep having this conversation about the deficits that the community sees. And I think oftentimes we think too much in the short term. We're thinking about the annual loss of this year that we might, be missing because of these tax exemptions. What we're not thinking about is the historic loss. CMU was not just created last year. These tax exemptions that, we're missing out on were not just last year. We're actually now in this day seeing issues because CMU and other institutions, I'm not saying CMU is at sole responsibility for everything. It falls upon all of our nonprofit institutions and other institutions as well. But like going back to Reagan, I mean, all of our taxes started getting dropped down considerably. The amount that the amount of contributions that we'd see from for-profits, nonprofits, et cetera, has dwindled so significantly. And then governments at localities that sometimes aren't actually even able to choose these taxes, these tax policies, because they're pushed from the federal, from the state, et cetera. They're forced to be put into austerity measures, figuring out what can we cut to shave the fat, when it comes to caring for the community. And that actually starts changing our collective consciousness. And so, I think it's really important that we also talk about the issues that we're seeing nowadays that are causes based on austerity measures from decades ago, because institutions like CMU were, getting these tax exemptions. And so, they should be paying their workers, they should be doing all of those things, but it's more than just focusing on the current. It's also addressing the deficits that are historically driven through this process.
I'm just going to say one small thing, which is that when you are the largest employers, you make the market. So the idea of being above market is somewhat goofy. I mean, you're setting the market. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I'll direct this next question to Lisa, and perhaps Dan, you can jump in as well. Is it better to have universities pay taxes that become part of government funding, or use the funds to invest in the communities in which they are situated?
Yes. I think there's room for both. I mean, you've picked up by now that I'm a little allergic to what we sometimes hear from large institutions around the question of taxation, which is like, we don't want to put money into the black hole of government. The black hole of government is where most of us live, and it's an important, I just want to say this: when people have a problem, they don't call CMU, they call 311, they call 911. Government is a site of democratic schooling. That's our schoolhouse mission. It's a site of community contestation, and sometimes if we rub our elbows in the right way, it's the site of profound learning. And so I think the first part of that, should there be money in the universal general fund? I really do. I think there is also, room for folks to engage locally with communities that have particular needs. I, again, would underscore something I think that Dan said, that I think Devarian said, that I think Ela has said. It is very different to say, hey, neighbor, let's get to know each other on different terms. We got some resources, you got some assets, everybody's got brains and hands here. What should we do together? And I'll just say parenthetically, there's also really fascinating research about this. Research that's about power being actually an incredibly important social determinant of health, apart from any of the things that are social determinants of health, that when communities actually have some control, even if what they're building is a daycare center, people's blood pressure drops. It's astonishing to see what happens in communities when there's power. So it's not investing in a local community in a way that I believe is ultimately helpful if your investment is, hey, we see a deficit in this community and we're going to come and fill it. I think that reinscribes a set of power relationships that are fundamentally unhealthy.
Yeah, and to tack onto that, I mean, I agree with Lisa. I personally think that taxes are always going to be better in the sense that it's actually a democratic allocation of funds, where the other processes might not be the same. And I actually didn't realize that the Center for Shared Prosperity worked in the way that you were describing, where it's not chosen by anyone within CMU; it's all external. And I think that's really good. But when I got into organizing, I was a labor union organizer, and something that we would always talk to workers about is, if your workplace is willing to, give you this dollar raise, then they should be willing to put it in a contract. They should be willing to make it a legally obligated thing that they will continue to fulfill. And at the end of the day, it comes back down to the same line of thought when it comes to taxation. If CMU is willing to make this commitment to the community, and they're willing to say, yeah, it's not our money, it belongs to the community, then put your money where your mouth is, just give it to the government. So it's not in your, in your coffers, and it's truly up to the city to choose where it goes. And when I say the city, I don't mean, a third party body. I mean us, because at the end of the day, that's where it should be.
Devarian, do you want to add to that?
I just want to say real quickly that I definitely think that taxation needs to happen. But considering the long history of universities and their collusion with state actors historically, the state or governance is not the only answer, particularly when my work looks at marginalized communities who have been exploited by the state in concert with universities. Alongside taxation, my work also advocates, for example, when it comes to indigenous communities, land back, which is a direct infusion of capital into indigenous communities and nations. My work also endorses reparations, which is a direct infusion of capital from universities and state into marginalized Black and brown communities because of the role that university-driven urban renewal, slavery, policing has directly impacted. And I don't trust necessarily the state to manage that, because the university became the friendly face of the state in enacting those crimes on those communities. So I think that we need taxation. We also need to be very sober about the ways in which the state, i.e. government, has worked with universities to exploit communities, and there sometimes needs to be direct infusion of capital or repair to compensate for those ends and those harms.
Thank you very much. I'll direct this final question to Ela if you happen to have insight in this. As we wrap up the panel and the campus community may look to take action on this issue, what protections are available to staff and students who wish to share their stories but may fear retaliation from the university?
I think it depends on the story that they're sharing and what they want to do with the story. There's straightforward ways to anonymize your storytelling through journalism. In other words, talk to Emma. Because then you can get your story told very professionally and to a large audience, but without the danger that you're identified. But in the end of the day, the best protection isn't anonymity, it's numbers. I'm Iranian, so I've been tracking everything happening in my country with extreme duress. The reason people are able to take their scarf off in Tehran right now and not have their scarf on isn't because there's any policy change. It's because half of the women in the entire city don't have a scarf on. And when half of the women don't have their scarf on, you have power. You have incredible power. So it is in the end the coming together of voice, whether GSA or other student groups. When you advocate for the change that you want with enough numbers behind you, there's no chance of anything negative happening to one person. Also, universities are precisely places where for at least 60 years, it's welcomed to have sharp-elbowed discourse, right? This is where we protest, and I led many protests on the campus of Stanford against war during the First and Second Gulf Wars. You can do this and get away with it in universities. It's a place where the idea of having strong opinion and then protesting against power and privilege is welcomed in general. So do it, because if only by doing it, you reinforce that this is okay in a university setting to have those difficult discussions and to be very strong about making the point that you need to make. And if you have a personal story and you do not know what to do with it and you really want guidance, reach out to the Center for Shared Prosperity and we'll come up with pathways for you. We're always available.
That's a great note to end on. I want to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise and their insights with everyone tonight, and thank everyone in the audience for sharing their questions and showing up to talk about this issue. Please stay connected with everyone. Our social media accounts are all linked, so you can follow more on this issue. And please join us outside. We will be having a reception catered by Sugar and Butter. And Devarian is planning to come to campus sometime this fall. So please stay tuned for an opportunity to meet him in person and talk further about this very complex but interesting issue. So thank you very much again, and I hope you have a great rest of your night. Take care.